So the first question is from Nathan, and it says, I did not set this up. He's invoking my book. In your book, Seeds of Empire, it is clear that slavery had a much bigger role in colonization and the revolution than what has been taught in the past. How do we address this, and how do we respond to the counter-argument of traditional Texas history that, quote, most Texans didn't own slaves? Is this just Texas exceptionalism trying to downplay the role of slavery in the revolution? That's a great question. I spent a whole book trying to talk about this issue. But the short answer is, um, how do we talk about this? The way I always teach it. So I teach Texas history every semester at UNT, and I do all of Texas history from cave people to last week. And the way I do it is I explain the perspectives of different groups, much like what we've been doing this whole week. And with the Anglo-Americans, I explained that the way to get rich if you're from this American South is to save up enough money to buy a slave so you can grow cotton on a big scale. That's going to make you wealthy, all right? And one of the ways that Texas becomes attractive is that you can get land for basically free if you come to Texas. So if you leave Mississippi, you don't have much money, you can come to Texas and get all the land for free that you would have had to pay a lot of money for back in the United States. What does that mean? Well, amongst other things, it means you can put all that money now into buying enslaved people, and you have an opportunity to increase your investments in a way that's going to make you very, very wealthy. Even poor Texas farmers who don't own slaves are growing cotton and hope one day to be able to have enough labor through slavery to grow it on a scale that means they'll become wealthy enough to have the money to buy a plantation house and all the good things they want from their families and things like that. So the way I always explain this is the economic model, right? This is the way up in the world. Are most people going to achieve it? No. Are most white Texans going to have enough money to buy their own slaves? No. But they all want to, because that's the way up in the world. That's the way to make a success for themselves. And you got to understand, they're living in a world where most people that surround them say slavery is a good thing, not just for us, the white planters, but it's good for the enslaved people. Obviously, that's total crap, but they believe that. So they're not having these huge moral quandaries by the 1830s about it. They aspire to these sort of successes, right? Much like in the American South, most white Southerners who fought in the Confederacy didn't own slaves, but they were fighting for a nation that was built on cotton that they wanted to support, that would make them wealthy if they ever could. They wanted that opportunity for themselves, right? And a lot more white Southerners and white Texans used slave labor than you might think, because a lot of them would rent slaves, even if they couldn't afford slaves when it was cotton picking time. The slave owners with a lot of slaves, like Jared Gross, would often rent their slaves to other people. So slavery was much more pervasive than the raw numbers might suggest. All right. The next question is, did the law of April 6, 1830 completely prohibit American immigration into Mexico or just Texas? I have read where American immigration was still allowed in other parts of Mexico, not just Texas. Yeah, so the answer is yes, you could have still, the answer of course is it's complicated. Yes, you could have still moved to Zacatecas or somewhere like that. The way it was written is that if you were not allowed to move into a province that was neighboring the country you left. Does that make sense? So if you left the United States, you weren't allowed in Texas or really New Mexico and California. So that was the way it was written. But it was directly, and we'll talk about this in the documents soon after the break, it was directly said to keep out the Americans. That's precisely what it was written for. And it was only the Americans that they were trying to keep out. Everybody else they would have been glad to take. But even within that, it didn't work at all. Stephen F. Austin got an exemption for the colony contract he was fulfilling. Green DeWitt got some exemption. It never got enforced. It didn't work. Mostly what it did was just make the Anglos mad, but it also made the Tejanos mad, and it made both of them believe in more strongly that they needed to be their own state to protect their own interests in all of this. All right. Next question from Josh. What do you think would have happened if the revolution was not successful and if Mexico retained the land? Woo! So I like what ifs. I play this with my kids a lot. and it's fun. The problem in history is that you get one, you get past one what if, and there's a million things that would have happened. I will say this: the odds of the Texans winning the revolution, if you were in Las Vegas, you would have put, you know, a million to one against the Texans. The base of the San Jacinto Monument actually has carved into it almost a miracle, as a quote, and I think that's pretty accurate. Um, the odds of them winning, and we could fight the whole Texas Revolution, are so small, but they do. If they hadn't won, probably what would have happened is this: Anglo colonization would have been ended in Texas. The United States very unlikely to have gotten involved because the United States did not want a war with Mexico. That was made very clear by Andrew Jackson and others. And Texas would have remained a part of Mexico for at least a while. I don't think it's inevitable that Texas joins the United States necessarily. I don't think, as a historian, anything's inevitable. I think it would be very possible that the United States would later push a war that, which is essentially what happens with the U.S.-Mexico war, that might claim Texas and the territories to California. But I think if Santa Anna doesn't lose and get captured at San Jacinto, we'd have a very different history, and I think we probably would have a very different map of North America today. That's just my guess. All right, let's see here. The next question from Gladys Scott. Even as an independent state, how could they have the authority to preserve slavery in their constitution if the country itself made slavery illegal at the federal level? Could their state constitution supersede the Mexican Constitution? That's a great question. And the answer is that the federal government had not made slavery illegal. And so let me explain this a little bit. So the Constitution of 1824 in Mexico said nothing about slavery on purpose. What that meant was that Mexico's national government did not outlaw slavery. And that meant the states could regulate it for themselves. So it was up to individual states to decide if slavery was legal or not. This is how the United States handled the slavery issue, right? Virginia said it wanted to have slavery. New York outlawed slavery. And so each state got to decide it for itself. That's what happens in Mexico. There is a moment in 1829 when the president of Mexico, a guy named Vicente Guerrero, outlaws slavery nationwide in Mexico. And that's often cited as when slavery ends in Mexico, but it's not true. Texas got an exemption from that decree, so it wasn't outlawed in Texas, and which is ironic because it's the only part of Mexico that has slavery. And then Guerrero gets thrown out of office, and all of those laws get rescinded anyway, so they all get canceled. So here's what the Texans are thinking when they want separate statehood. If they get separate statehood, they can write a state constitution that preserved slavery. And the Mexican National Constitution of 1824 will mean that that is valid. It's another reason why they're so supportive of restoring the Constitution of 1824. That's their ticket to being able to determine things for themselves, especially the slavery issue, but pretty much everything that goes on in Texas. So it's often assumed, or it's often believed, that Mexico as a nation outlawed slavery. That never happened until, actually, it doesn't happen until 1837. They pass a law after the Texas Revolution. But at this time, the states are the ones that decide it, which is why Texans are so focused on becoming their own independent state. All right, so next question, this will probably be our last one for right now. Mexico did not come to Texas and teach them how they wanted to behave. What role did Mexico play in not bringing Texas completely into Mexican society? So the idea at the beginning, when Spain gives permission and then Mexico upholds it for the Austin colony, is that these colonists will become Anglo-Mexicans eventually. They'll all be Catholic, they'll all follow Mexican laws, they'll become citizens, all that sort of stuff. And so Mexico tried to set up a couple basic things that would integrate Texans into Mexican society, which is predominantly being Catholic. And having a stake in that society, because if you own land there, then you want to support that government, right? The problem became Mexico really didn't control Texas. I mean, honestly, that's what it comes down to. We got a sense of this, I think, in the first day of the Institute, where the Indians of Texas are more powerful than pretty much any other group in the region. And so Mexico really couldn't enforce any of this. And the Anglos are colonizing eastern Texas, where there's almost nobody else except Indians and Anglos coming in. So Mexico doesn't have a big presence there. And so what you have in Texas is this division between East Texas, where the Anglos are, and then West Texas, where the Tejanos and the rest of Mexico are. And there's not a lot of overlap. And so these two areas basically develop differently. And so the Anglos can kind of be in this area that feels a lot like the United States to them and doesn't feel like a lot of Mexico. Stephen F. Austin, he's different. He's going to San Antonio. He's going to Saltillo in Coahuila. He's going down to Mexico City. So he's being a part of the rest of Mexico and integrating himself. And he learns enough Spanish to do very well. But a lot of other Anglos did not experience that. As far as they felt, it was Texas felt a lot like an extension of Louisiana and Mississippi. And that's a largely result of Mexico not being able to have a stronger presence in the region. All right, so I think